Have you ever overheard something that wasn't meant for you, and instantly knew your life would never be the same? That night, Michael Hartley heard just one sentence, spoken softly, almost in a whisper, a request that was never meant to be heard. And before he could even understand why, something inside him cracked, not all at once, but slowly. Too quietly to stop, too deeply to ignore. Michael wasn't searching for answers that night. He wasn't looking for change. He just wanted to get through another ordinary evening, walking through the immaculate silence of his Upper West Side apartment in New York. Spacious, elegant, carefully arranged, and completely empty. From the outside, his life looked perfect. Success, respect, stability. But there was a weariness that didn't come from work. It lived deeper than that. Hard to explain, easy to dismiss, until that moment. Michael was walking toward the bedroom when a voice drifted out of the kitchen. Too quiet to be casual conversation. Too fragile to ignore. He slowed his steps without realizing it, as if his body had reacted before his mind could catch up. The voice was controlled, trembling, urgent. Completely out of place in a home that clean, that silent, that untouched. I'm serious, Lucy. Tomorrow is the wedding, and I can't show up alone. Michael stopped. Not out of curiosity, but because something in that sentence hit him in a way he couldn't explain, almost physically. The voice continued, heavier now, as if each word had to be dragged out. I tried to be strong, I really did. But there comes a point when you just can't carry everything by yourself anymore. It was Emma, the woman who had worked in his home for years. Always quiet. Always punctual. Always careful to take up as little space as possible, as if being unseen was the safest way to exist. Michael had never heard her like this. Truthfully, he had never really heard her at all. On the other end of the call, someone was listening. And Emma spoke fast, almost stumbling over her own words, like someone afraid that if she paused, she might lose the courage to keep going. I don't need love. I don't need promises, she said. I just need to not disappoint my mother, just for one day. The air in the hallway felt heavier. Michael knew he should walk away. He knew this wasn't his conversation to hear. He knew that listening meant crossing a line. But his feet didn't move. Because that voice wasn't just traveling through the walls of the apartment. It was cutting straight through something inside him. And without realizing it, Michael Hartley had just crossed his first point of no return. The silence that filled the apartment after the call ended wasn't the same as before. It wasn't neutral. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was heavy, almost accusatory, as if the walls themselves were now aware of what had been said. Michael stood in the hallway far longer than he meant to, staring at the empty space ahead of him, feeling his body resist any automatic movement. The sound of running water from the sink continued steadily, a simple, domestic noise that felt almost cruel in contrast to what he had just heard. Something inside him was no longer where it belonged. For years, his life had operated with near mathematical precision. Clearly defined schedules. Carefully contained emotions. Relationships kept at a safe distance, far enough not to interfere with the efficiency of the next day. And now, without warning, that internal order was falling apart. Michael knew he should step away. He knew he had no right to linger after overhearing something so intimate. He knew the correct thing to do was move on and pretend nothing had happened. But his body refused to obey. It was as if that conversation had taken invisible root around his feet. When soft footsteps echoed down the hallway, he felt them before he saw her. Emma appeared, drying her hands on her apron, her face carefully composed. Her eyes still betrayed the recent tears, but there was a desperate attempt in her posture to return to the role that had always kept her safe in that space. She hadn't expected to see him there. The shock was immediate, silent, but complete. For a brief moment, she looked too small for the wide hallway, as if the space itself was conspiring to expose her vulnerability. Their eyes met. Quick, uncomfortable, loaded with unspoken things. Limits crossed without intention. An intimacy neither of them had chosen. Michael recognized the fear in her instantly. Not exaggerated. Not dramatic. The quiet fear of someone who depends on stability. Of someone who knows that a single misstep can cost more than pride. It can cost livelihood, security, dignity. She tried to say something. Anything that might reorganize the moment. But her voice didn't come out steady, and the silence stretched between them like a minefield. Michael raised his hand in a small, almost involuntary gesture. Not to assert authority, but to stop the collapse unfolding in front of him. When he spoke, he noticed his own voice sounded different. Lower. Less certain. Stripped of the automatic confidence he used in meetings and major decisions. He explained, simply, that he'd overheard her by accident. That it hadn't been intentional. That he'd been walking past when her voice reached him. Even as he spoke, he knew the explanation wasn't enough. Because the issue wasn't the act of hearing. It was the fact that now he knew. Emma nodded silently, eyes lowered, the instinct of someone apologizing before being accused. That hit him harder than he expected. For years, Michael had believed that keeping his distance was a form of respect. Now he realized that distance had also been a comfortable kind of blindness, an efficient way not to see the lives quietly unfolding around him. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The fatigue settled into her posture. The hands worn from constant work. The way she tried to take up as little space as possible, even inside an apartment she kept immaculate every day. It was there, in that hallway, that Michael felt the first real shift inside himself. Until then, his loneliness had always been abstract. A quiet discomfort he blamed on success, on the city's pace, on necessary choices. But after hearing Emma's story, after recognizing the weight she carried alone, his loneliness took on a different shape. Less noble. Less justifiable. He realized he could no longer go back to the office and pretend nothing had happened. Because that sentence kept echoing in his mind, repeating with an unsettling persistence. She needed someone. For one day. Not for romance. Not for desire. But for emotional survival. That realization shook him more than any professional crisis he'd ever faced. Emma eventually moved away, returning to her tasks with an artificial rigidity. Michael saw the effort it took for her to pull herself back together, to become invisible again, as if invisibility were her strongest protection. He walked into his office, closed the door, and sat at his desk. Opened documents he couldn't read. Stared at numbers that no longer made sense. Something essential had changed. And he still didn't know what to do with it. For the first time in a long while, Michael felt out of control. Not because something was going wrong, but because something was demanding an answer that couldn't be calculated. Night fell, and the silence in the apartment was no longer neutral. Every room seemed to carry echoes of that conversation. Every hallway reminded him that there was a life moving quietly inside that space, one he had never allowed himself to truly see. Michael thought about all the nights he'd come home late, exhausted, wrapped up in his own problems, while Emma kept everything running without ever sharing the weight of what she carried beyond those walls. He thought about how easy it had always been to choose not to get involved, not to ask, not to know. And he realized that privilege had been broken. The stability that had always protected him had been cracked by a single sentence. What disturbed him most was that instead of wanting to restore that stability, part of him felt curious. Another part felt guilty. And a third, more dangerous than the others, felt something close to hope. Hope that maybe this rupture had a purpose. Michael stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city lights. Millions of lives unfolding at once, each carrying private urgencies, hidden struggles. For the first time, he wondered how many stories like Emma's went unnoticed every single day, ignored by people like him. In that moment, Michael hardly understood something irreversible. He had crossed a line, because now he knew too much to pretend indifference. Ignoring it would be a conscious choice, no longer a comfortable omission. Something was pushing him out of the safe role of observer and into a place where decisions didn't come with guarantees or protective clauses. And even without knowing what his next step would be, he was certain of one thing. The routine that had always defined him was broken. And from that night on, any choice he made would carry consequences. Michael didn't sleep that night. It wasn't ordinary insomnia, the kind that fades with exhaustion. This was physical, persistent. His mind refused to slow down, circling the same image, the same voice, the same sentence, now echoing through the apartment as if the walls themselves had overheard it too. He turned from side to side, tried controlling his breathing, mentally recited lists of tasks, numbers, appointments for the next day. Nothing worked. Every time he closed his eyes, the same sensation returned. Something inside him had been displaced, knocked out of alignment, and there was no way to simply push it back into place. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, he gave up on sleep. He got up quietly and walked to the living room, staring out the window at the city. A few lights still on in distant buildings. The occasional car passing below. Life going on, while his felt suspended at a single point in time. He tried to convince himself this wasn't his problem. He repeated that there were clear boundaries, professional, social, moral. That overhearing something by accident didn't create responsibility. That respect, in this case, meant not getting involved. But the more he repeated those thoughts, the weaker they sounded. Not because they were wrong, but because they couldn't explain what he was feeling. Morning came, and routine tried to reclaim its place. Coffee made at the same time. The cup set in the same spot. The news playing softly in the background as the city woke up outside. Everything looked the same. And yet, everything was different. There was something in the air, subtle, almost imperceptible, like walking into a room after an argument no one mentions, but the silence is too heavy to ignore. Emma avoided crossing his path. She moved through the apartment with even more care than before, every step calculated to avoid another accidental encounter. Michael noticed it with uncomfortable clarity. Now he saw the effort, the tension in her shoulders, the way she tried to disappear. And seeing it made him feel something close to guilt. Because before, he simply hadn't noticed. He tried to work. He joined video meetings, answered important emails, took calls, but his attention kept slipping, returning again and again to the same unanswered questions. Where does responsibility begin when you hear something you were never meant to hear? At what point does ignoring become cowardice instead of respect? These questions didn't accuse him outright. They lingered. A constant background noise he couldn't mute. Mid-afternoon, a phone call shifted the tone of the day. Michael answered without much thought, until he recognized the voice of an old friend, casually talking about a wedding out of town, a quick trip, a social obligation treated as something trivial. Michael responded politely, but something tightened inside him. It wasn't the same wedding. He knew that. But the coincidence was enough. An image formed against his will. Emma arriving alone, facing expectant looks, quiet questions, unspoken judgments. He hung up and stared at the dark screen of his phone for several seconds. And that's when he realized something unsettling. This was no longer just about her. It was about him. About the way he'd always protected himself with neutrality, with safe distance, with the habit of not getting involved so he wouldn't have to feel. That evening, when he returned home, He found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread in front of her, phone in hand, her expression tense and deeply focused. Michael stopped at the doorway and watched for a moment. When she noticed she wasn't alone, the startle was small but real. She straightened up immediately, gathering the papers too quickly, as if she'd been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to. He understood without words. She was still searching for a solution. Still trying to find someone. Anyone. And that realization hurt in a way he hadn't expected. Not jealousy, but recognition. She was exposing herself to rejection after rejection, just to uphold an image the world demanded, an image that wasn't even truly hers. Michael walked past her in silence and retreated to his bedroom, feeling the weight settle in his chest. Lying in the dark that night, old memories surfaced. Social events he'd attended alone. Questions disguised as curiosity. Polite smiles layered with judgment. 4 years, he'd told himself he didn't care. That solitude was a conscious choice. Now he saw how much of that choice had been learned numbness. Sometime after midnight, Michael got out of bed again. He walked through the apartment in silence until he stopped outside Emma's door. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just stood there, fighting the urge to say something, anything, before stepping back. Not yet. The next day, something unexpected happened. Emma asked to speak with him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't urgent. Just a simple, almost formal request. Still, there was something in her posture that made it clear this wouldn't be a trivial conversation. They met in the living room, daylight pouring through the windows, making everything feel exposed. Michael could tell she had rehearsed every word in her mind as she explained that she would need to be away for a few days. The wedding would be out of town. Everything was already arranged. Throughout the conversation, she carefully avoided any mention of what he had overheard, as if they were both participating in a silent agreement to pretend that fracture had never existed. Michael nodded, responded with neutral phrases, kept his tone controlled. But inside, the tension was building. Now there was a deadline, a date, an invisible countdown. After she left the room, Michael remained there for several minutes, staring at the empty space, feeling something close inside him, a sense of loss before anything had even happened. Letting her go like that would confirm the comfortable choice he'd always made. Do nothing. Step away when something demanded courage. That's when he realized, with a clarity that was difficult to admit, that he was already too involved to pretend indifference. The danger now wasn't external. It wasn't scandal or conflict. It was internal. A silent struggle between continuing to be the man he had always been, or risking crossing a line he had never crossed before. If this choice sent a chill through you, take a moment to like the video. Because from here on out, there's no turning back. Over the next few days, Michael began noticing small things he would have once ignored. The way Emma organized her bag with excessive care. The way she spoke on the phone in hushed tones. The tension in her shoulders growing heavier as the wedding drew closer. Each detail increased the urgency. Each silence added weight. He knew that any decision made from that point forward would alter the balance of that apartment, that relationship, and possibly the identity he had built over years. One evening, as he watched her step out the door to run an errand, Michael felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Not fear of losing control, but fear of losing the chance to do something different. Something unsafe, but human. And right there, in that rising tension, he understood something definitive. He was no longer just watching a story unfold. He was inside it. Moving forward into unfamiliar territory, where every choice carried consequences he couldn't yet predict. Night settled over the city. Inside the apartment, silence became a presence. Dense, almost tangible, as if the walls themselves were aware of what was about to happen. Michael sat motionless for a long time, feeling his body respond to a decision that hadn't yet been spoken out loud, but already existed inside him with unsettling clarity. For years, he believed control came from distance, from observing without engaging, from following invisible rules that shielded him from emotional impact. It had always worked. Until now. Because that night, those rules felt too fragile to carry the weight of what he knew. Emma would be leaving in the morning. The thought sounded simple, but it carried meaning he couldn't ignore. Letting her leave like that would once again confirm the safest choice. Not acting. He stood and walked through the apartment slowly, each step feeling like an internal crossing. He stopped near the window, watching the city lights, streets still alive with people coming and going, unaware that, in that exact moment, a silent decision was taking shape. No one was pressuring him. No one was asking anything of him. And yet, the weight was immense. Because now he understood that every choice, including the choice to do nothing, would carry consequences. When he heard Emma's footsteps in the hallway, his chest tightened. Not surprise. Recognition. She appeared with a small bag over her shoulder, simple clothes, the tired face of someone who had spent days holding something together that was about to collapse. She avoided looking at him, moving carefully, as if trying to pass through the space without leaving a trace. Watching her head toward the door, Michael knew that image would become permanent if he didn't stop her. He called her name. The word carried more weight than he expected. Emma froze, still facing away from him. The silence between them thickened, heavy with everything that had gone unspoken since that night in the hallway. Michael approached slowly, each step breaking away from the version of himself that had always chosen the safest path. He didn't apologize. He didn't justify. He didn't soften the moment. He spoke the truth he had been avoiding. He said he couldn't pretend he hadn't heard her. Couldn't pretend it hadn't changed him. That ignoring it now would be a conscious choice, no longer a convenient accident. Emma turned slowly, her posture defensive, rigid, like someone bracing to be pushed back into the small space she'd learned to occupy just to survive. Michael saw the real stakes in that moment. Not just the wedding, but years of swallowed silence. Imposed expectations. Dignity maintained at the cost of loneliness. He felt the weight of his own social position, the invisible authority he'd carried without ever noticing. For the first time, it didn't feel powerful. It felt suffocating. The words came out with effort. Not because he doubted them, but because each one broke something old inside him. He made it clear this wasn't pity, not impulse, not charity. It was a response to something that had awakened after a long time asleep. Then he said it. Plain. Unadorned. Honest. He could go with her. He could stand beside her for that day. He could fill that space she needed to hold for her family. He could pretend, if necessary. Because the greater truth was this. Pretending indifference had become impossible. The impact was immediate. Emma stepped back, not just physically, but emotionally, as if the ground beneath her had suddenly shifted. She tried to refuse. She tried to argue. She tried to protect herself. Not from him, but from the possibility of needing someone. Even if it was only for a single day. Michael felt the force of that resistance. Not as rejection, but as self-defense. The room seemed to slow down. Every second stretched between them, heavy with unspoken differences, social distance, professional boundaries, consequences neither of them needed to name to know they were real. Michael realized he had reached the edge. That precise point where a life splits into before and after. No matter how she responded, he had already crossed that line the moment he spoke those words. He didn't step back. He didn't negotiate. He didn't soften the offer. He stayed. Present. Open. Willing to accept the risk. Aware that this decision came with no manual, No guarantees, no return policy. Emma closed her eyes for a long moment, long enough to weigh everything she could lose by accepting, and everything she had already lost trying not to need anyone. When she opened them, something had shifted. Not hope, not relief, but a cautious surrender, the kind that comes when there are no safe exits left. She made her conditions clear. If she accepted, it couldn't be mistaken for a promise, or a future, or feelings. It would be temporary, defined, necessary, a fragile agreement. Michael agreed without hesitation. In that moment, he wasn't looking for a future. He was choosing presence. He was choosing to cross the line he had always avoided. Her acceptance came quietly, almost a whisper. But the impact was seismic. Right there, in that silent space, the structure that had held Michael's life together collapsed without noise, without witnesses, only with the certainty that nothing would return to what it had been. He felt a mix of fear and clarity. The understanding that he had chosen the most uncertain path, and precisely because of that, the most honest one. There was no celebration, no immediate relief, only a new kind of silence, heavier, charged with responsibility and possibility. That night, neither of them truly slept, not from ordinary anxiety, but because they both knew they had crossed a point of no return. The decision was made. Morning would bring movement, roads, exposure. But before that, there was this suspended space in time, where everything was still too fragile to name. The house would look the same in the morning. But inside, nothing would be in its old place anymore. Morning arrived differently. Not because anything looked different, but because the air itself felt altered, as if the walls were still holding the echo of the decision made the night before. Michael woke up too early, long before the alarm had a chance to do its job. He lay still for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight in his body. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was the strange heaviness that follows a point of no return, when the mind knows nothing can be taken back. He moved quietly through the apartment, careful with every sound, as if afraid of breaking something fragile still trying to rearrange itself inside him. The city was waking up outside, cars passing, distant horns, the familiar rhythm returning. The world hadn't stopped. Emma was already awake. He knew by the soft light in the kitchen, by the controlled movements, by the deliberate care in every gesture. There was something ceremonial about the morning, as if both of them understood that even the smallest actions carried symbolic weight. They shared the same space for several minutes without looking directly at each other. Coffee brewing, water boiling, a cup touching the counter, ordinary sounds moving at an unfamiliar pace. There was no room for long conversations, no explanations, no second thoughts, only quiet recognition. Michael felt something close to guilt, not for making the offer, but for realizing how much risk he had placed on her shoulders. That guilt came with uncomfortable clarity, because he also knew he couldn't have acted differently without betraying something essential inside himself. Emma avoided his gaze, not out of resentment, but protection, as if eye contact might open doors she wasn't ready to step through yet. At one point, she picked up a small suitcase near the door. Simple, modest, and suddenly, that object carried enormous weight. She was going. Time was moving. And nothing felt ready. Fear, doubt, and a new kind of calm, not born of safety, but of honesty. He wondered, without needing an answer yet, how that decision had begun to reorganize his identity. How the man who had always stayed distant was now involved in a story he couldn't fully control. Emma, meanwhile, carried her own quiet fall, the fall of someone who accepts help after years of learning not to need it. Someone who allows themselves to be seen without guarantees. At one point, she took a deep breath, as if about to speak, then didn't. Michael respected the silence. There was no space for promises, only for holding. They stopped for gas, an ordinary, forgettable act. And yet, Michael was struck by how normal everything looked. People coming and going. Casual conversations. Life continuing. While inside the car, both of them were crossing something that would change how they saw the world. He paid, got back in, and as they returned to the road, the symbolic weight of the gesture hit him. He was caring. He was present. He was taking responsibility, without guarantees. The drive continued like that. Layers of silence. Small gestures. Each mile took them further from the life they knew and closer to something undefined. Michael understood this wasn't resolution. Not healing. Not beginning or ending. It was transition. A fragile space between what had been and what had yet to reveal itself. And that instability, unsettling as it was, carried a truth he could no longer ignore. The world was no longer the same. Even if everything around them behaved as though nothing had changed. Michael returned home a few days later. At first glance, everything looked exactly the same. The furniture in the same place. Objects arranged with the same precision. The familiar silence filling the rooms as it always had. And yet, something was different. Not in the apartment. In him. The change hadn't happened in the space or the routine trying to reassemble itself. It had happened deeper, in a place that no longer accepted silence as an answer. He returned to work almost immediately. Meetings. Calls. Deadlines. Decisions. Everything functioned. From the outside, nothing seemed off. Inside, something had shifted permanently. Michael moved through his days with a new kind of attention, listening not only to what was said, but to what usually hides in pauses, in averted eyes, in sentences that never quite finish. Emma went on with her life. And that wasn't a loss. Nor was it a victory. It was simply a fact. Some people enter our lives not to stay, but to move us, to pull us out of the comfortable place where we don't even realize we're hiding. Michael understood that with a clarity that didn't hurt, but didn't soothe either. He didn't become a different man overnight. There was no instant redemption. No dramatic transformation. What changed was quieter and more real. He began to notice when he was pulling away. When he was hiding behind distance. When he chose detachment simply to avoid feeling. That awareness didn't come with easy solutions. But it changed everything, because it made returning to autopilot impossible. There were days when the memory of the trip surfaced unexpectedly. A stretch of road. A small gesture. A shared silence inside the car. Not as nostalgia, but as reference. An internal marker he now used to measure his choices. That experience had created a new internal standard. A measure of presence he could no longer ignore. Some questions remained unanswered. And maybe they always would. What would have happened if he had chosen not to act? Where does responsibility truly begin? How many times had he confused neutrality with respect, when it was really just fear? These questions didn't demand immediate answers. They existed to keep something alive inside him. Something alert. Something awake. Michael learned that not every story needs closure to make sense. Some exist simply to teach us how to look differently. To listen better. To notice what we once overlooked. Over time, he noticed subtle changes in himself. Small things. Almost invisible to anyone watching from the outside. More attention in conversations. Less urgency to withdraw. A deeper discomfort with his own indifference. None of that made him better. But it made him more conscious. And that consciousness carried weight, a weight he now accepted. Michael understood something he had never learned before. Being present isn't about fixing. It isn't about saving. It isn't about solving. Often, it's just about staying. About remaining when it would be easier to leave. Listening when there is no answer ready. Accepting the risk of feeling without the guarantee of control. And that changed everything. Because after that experience, he could no longer ignore the impact of simply not abandoning. Even without promises. Even without guarantees. Even knowing that not everything gets resolved. Some things don't need to be fixed. They just need to be held. And now, this is where the story turns to you. If you stayed until the end, maybe something here felt familiar. Maybe you've carried everything alone for too long. Maybe you've pretended you were fine so no one would worry. Maybe you needed help and didn't know how to ask. Maybe you overheard something you weren't meant to hear, and it changed everything. Or maybe you were the one on the other end of the line, trying to stay strong while everything inside was quietly falling apart. This story isn't just about Michael or Emma. It's about those invisible moments when life asks for presence instead of solutions. Listening instead of answers. Courage instead of indifference. Sometimes, what someone needs most isn't to be saved, it's not to be ignored. Sometimes, it's not about fixing, it's about caring. And sometimes, the most transformative act isn't something grand. It's simply choosing to stay, when it would be easier to walk away. If this story found you in a tender place, know this. That isn't weakness. It's humanity. And feeling together is one of the quietest and most powerful forms of resistance we have. Thank you for being here. And I'll see you in the next story.